Most people completely misunderstand this stage, and because of that misunderstanding, they respond to it in ways that often make the situation even more confusing. When someone with avoidant tendencies starts pulling back just as the relationship begins feeling emotionally meaningful, the first assumption is almost always the same. People immediately believe it means a lack of interest, rejection, or intentional emotional games. But the deeper truth is usually much more complicated. In many cases, what you are seeing is not the absence of feelings at all. It is the activation of fear. Someone with avoidant patterns usually has little difficulty with casual conversations or light-hearted connections. Surface-level interactions feel comfortable because they do not require deep emotional openness. They allow the person to maintain independence, control, and emotional distance while still enjoying companionship. But the moment the relationship starts carrying real emotional significance, something begins shifting inside them. Conversations become deeper, emotional closeness slowly grows, the bond begins to matter. Suddenly, the relationship is no longer casual or temporary, it feels real, and that is often the exact moment their protective defenses begin to activate. They are no longer just spending time with someone. Now they risk being fully understood. They risk being emotionally seen. For someone who has spent years relying on emotional self-protection, that level of vulnerability can feel deeply uncomfortable. Stay with me, because this next part explains why their behavior can seem so confusing. Instead of naturally moving closer, they often begin creating distance. Sometimes the withdrawal is easy to notice. Other times it happens so quietly that you only recognize it after some time has passed. Their replies become slower. Their emotional warmth begins to fade. They stop sharing as openly as they once did. They seem distracted or suddenly become consumed by work, hobbies, or other responsibilities. In some situations, they even convince themselves that something about the relationship no longer feels right. None of these reactions appear out of nowhere. They are usually protective responses designed to reduce the discomfort they feel inside. Here is the contradiction that confuses so many people. The stronger the emotional connection becomes, the stronger their urge to create space can also become. From the outside, this behavior seems to make no sense. Someone starts opening up, becomes emotionally closer, and then unexpectedly pulls away. But psychologically, it follows a pattern. For people with avoidant tendencies, emotional closeness and emotional danger often become connected in the mind. The very thing they secretly long for is also the thing their nervous system may associate with losing control, becoming overwhelmed, facing rejection, or depending too heavily on another person. So just as the relationship begins matching their deeper emotional desires, fear interrupts the process. Think about what that really means. If someone has spent years believing emotional independence is the safest way to survive, intimacy does not simply feel unfamiliar. It challenges the very system they built to protect themselves. Naturally, that creates inner conflict. Different people respond to emotional tension in different ways. Some move closer because they want reassurance. Others instinctively create distance. The avoidant pattern usually creates distance. That does not mean emotionally unavailable behavior becomes healthy or should simply be accepted without question. It does not mean inconsistency should be ignored. What it does mean is that you stop viewing every moment of distance as proof that you are never important. Because the moment you mistake fear for indifference, your own reactions often become driven by emotion instead of understanding. You begin chasing answers. You overthink every conversation. You try even harder to prove your value. Ironically, those reactions often increase the avoidant person's need to retreat even further. What is actually needed is awareness. You begin recognizing that withdrawal is not always evidence that the relationship meant nothing. In many situations, it is evidence that the relationship became emotionally meaningful enough to activate protective defenses in the first place. Once you understand that, your perspective starts changing. You stop personalizing every shift in energy. You stop reacting impulsively to every moment of silence. Instead, you begin noticing the pattern underneath the behavior. Their actions are not always a reflection of your worth. More often, they reflect their own emotional fear. After all, people rarely run from something that means nothing to them. More often, they pull away from something that has the power to affect them deeply. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, strong emotional impact can feel dangerously close to losing emotional control. That is why they retreat, not because they feel nothing, but because they have not yet learned how to stay emotionally present without feeling threatened by the closeness. That leads to an important question. Are you reacting emotionally to what they are doing, or are you trying to understand the psychology behind it? The answer shapes everything that happens next. It determines whether you become trapped inside their emotional cycle or remain grounded in your own emotional stability. At that point, the situation is no longer only about their behavior. It becomes about your ability to see reality clearly without abandoning your own peace in the process. Once you recognize that their distance often comes from fear instead of simple lack of care, you stop desperately searching for reassurance from them and begin creating emotional security within yourself. That changes everything. But after you understand the first stage of withdrawal, another confusing layer usually appears. It is no longer only about distance, it becomes about inconsistency. One day they feel emotionally available, engaged, deeply connected, and fully present. The next day, they seem emotionally unreachable, distracted, detached, or unavailable. Without understanding the psychology behind these shifts, this pattern can become emotionally exhausting. Yet mixed signals are rarely random. They are often the visible signs of an internal struggle. One part of them sincerely wants connection. They genuinely desire intimacy, emotional closeness, understanding, and the comfort of being accepted by someone who matters to them. That desire is completely real. At the very same time, another part fears everything that intimacy represents. Emotional closeness may unconsciously feel connected to dependence, loss of freedom, emotional exposure, or overwhelming expectations. Keep listening, because this final insight connects all the pieces together. Because both desires exist at once, they constantly feel pulled in opposite directions. That is why their behavior appears unpredictable. They move closer when the relationship feels emotionally safe. They create distance when closeness begins feeling overwhelming. Their desire encourages them to step forward. Their fear urges them to step back. Since much of this conflict happens beneath conscious awareness, their outward behavior naturally becomes inconsistent. To them, it often feels like they are protecting themselves. To you, it feels confusing and emotionally draining. What makes inconsistency so powerful is that the human mind naturally searches for certainty. Consistency allows you to relax because you understand where you stand. Inconsistency does the opposite. It keeps your attention locked onto the relationship. You begin replaying conversations, analyzing every message, and questioning your own actions. Without realizing it, you can become emotionally attached to the uncertainty itself. You keep waiting for the emotionally available version of them to return because you have already experienced moments where they seemed completely open and deeply connected. Those moments become emotionally rewarding enough to keep hope alive, yet not stable enough to create genuine security. That is why mixed signals can feel so consuming, but it is important to understand what you are actually seeing. You are not dealing with someone who feels emotionally stable, but simply chooses to act inconsistently. You are often dealing with someone who is internally divided between genuine desire and genuine fear. And if your response becomes chasing consistency even harder, you unintentionally strengthen the unhealthy cycle. The more energy you invest trying to stabilize the relationship for both of you, the less responsibility there is for them to face their own emotional patterns. The real shift is not about decoding every change in behavior. The real shift comes from recognizing what the inconsistency is revealing. It reveals emotional conflict and inner misalignment. And when someone is not emotionally aligned within themselves, they cannot consistently provide the safety, stability, and security that a healthy relationship requires, no matter how genuine or meaningful certain moments together may feel. That does not automatically make them cruel or uncaring. It often means they are emotionally unprepared for the level of closeness the relationship is asking from them. And this is exactly where your own clarity becomes so important. You stop bargaining for consistency by giving more of yourself. You stop believing emotional stability is something you have to earn through patience, sacrifice, or endless understanding. Instead, you begin seeing consistency for what it truly is, a reflection of someone's emotional readiness. Over time, you start asking yourself a completely different question. Are you connected to who this person consistently shows themselves to be, or are you holding on to the version of them that only appears during rare moments of emotional openness? Those are two very different realities. Once that distinction becomes clear, their inconsistency begins losing much of its emotional control over you. You stop getting swept into every emotional high and low. You stop confusing emotional intensity with genuine emotional depth. Instead of constantly wondering why they behave this way, you begin asking something much more valuable. What am I truly willing to accept? That single question changes your entire place within the relationship. Real emotional clarity begins the moment you stop investing your energy in confusion and start valuing steadiness, honesty, openness, and mutual emotional presence instead. Stay with me, because the next stage explains why so many people become trapped in this cycle without even realizing it. This is often the point where confusion reaches its highest level because the behavior feels completely contradictory. It is not only that someone with avoidant tendencies struggles with closeness, it is that immediately after moments of genuine emotional connection, they often begin creating distance, and that sudden shift can feel incredibly disorienting. You share a meaningful conversation. There is honesty, openness, emotional presence, maybe even vulnerability. For a brief moment, Everything feels stable. It feels as though the relationship has finally reached a deeper level. You begin believing that lasting progress has finally been made. Then, almost without warning, everything changes. They become quieter, less emotionally available, less expressive. Sometimes they disappear into silence altogether, almost as if the very closeness that brought both of you together somehow pushed them away at the same time. If you look only through the lens of emotion, this naturally feels painful. It can feel like rejection. It can feel inconsistent. It can make you question whether those intimate moments meant anything at all. But when you begin looking at the pattern psychologically instead of personally, it starts making much more sense. For someone with avoidant patterns, intimacy creates more than connection. It also activates their nervous system. Emotional closeness, no matter how real it is, can awaken deeper fears hidden beneath the surface. Openness creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates exposure, and exposure may unconsciously trigger fears of dependence, losing control, abandonment, or emotional overwhelm. Those fears often appear automatically, even when the person genuinely cares. Don't miss this next part because it changes how you understand everything that follows. For someone who has learned, consciously or unconsciously, that emotional dependence eventually leads to pain, those feelings create an internal alarm almost immediately. That is why the withdrawal that follows is often not calculated manipulation. More often, it is emotional regulation. Their nervous system instinctively attempts to restore a feeling of safety by creating distance. Imagine it this way: they are capable of closeness, but only within a certain emotional comfort zone. Once the relationship moves beyond that limit and begins feeling deeply significant, their protective defenses activate, pulling them back toward what feels familiar and emotionally manageable. That process often appears as silence, detachment, emotional distance, or an intense focus on independence. The important thing to remember is this: the intimacy itself was not fake. In many situations, those vulnerable moments were actually the most genuine parts of the relationship. The issue is not that the closeness lacked meaning. The issue is that it carried more emotional weight than they were prepared to comfortably hold. If you fail to recognize that difference, you begin doubting moments that were actually real. You replay conversations. You search for mistakes. You convince yourself that you said the wrong thing or somehow caused the emotional shift. But when you step back and observe the overall pattern, it becomes much clearer. Closeness activates fear. Fear creates distance. Distance eventually leads to reconnection. Then the cycle quietly repeats itself. Understanding this pattern helps you stop blaming yourself for reactions that were already taking place inside them long before you ever entered their life. This is where your own emotional awareness becomes incredibly valuable. When someone pulls away immediately after intimacy, your natural instinct is usually to restore the connection as quickly as possible. You want to reach out. You want to reassure them. You want to reconnect emotionally and return the relationship to the warmth it had only moments before. But for someone with avoidant tendencies, that immediate pursuit often feels overwhelming instead of comforting. At the exact moment they are trying to create emotional space to calm themselves internally, your movement toward them may unintentionally feel like pressure, and pressure usually increases their desire to retreat even further. Without either person realizing it, both people begin strengthening the same unhealthy cycle. One person withdraws to regain emotional safety, the other moves closer to regain emotional security. The pattern continues repeating itself again and again. That is why emotional awareness matters so much. Once you understand that their distance is often a response to emotional intensity rather than proof that the relationship lacks meaning, you stop reacting impulsively. You stop feeling responsible for immediately fixing every emotional gap. Instead, you learn how to allow space without losing your own emotional balance. You recognize that intimacy is not something they naturally sustain with ease. In many ways, their nervous system feels the need to recover after moments of deep closeness, and once you genuinely understand that, your perspective begins changing in a healthier direction. That does not mean you endlessly tolerate emotionally unhealthy behavior. It does not mean you ignore your own needs or accept ongoing emotional disconnection. What it does mean is that you stop carrying responsibility for patterns that began long before you arrived. You stop taking every retreat personally. You stop assuming every moment of distance somehow proves you are not enough. Instead, you begin making decisions from a calmer, more grounded place. The deeper truth is that healthy relationships are not built only on powerful emotional moments. They are built on the ability to remain emotionally connected without fear constantly interrupting the bond. If every meaningful moment of closeness is followed by withdrawal, the relationship eventually becomes emotionally unstable. The cycle repeats endlessly. Connection grows, fear interrupts it, distance follows, reconnection happens, then everything starts all over again. Over time, that pattern does not strengthen love. It slowly exhausts it. That is why the most important question is not whether those intimate moments were genuine. Very often, they absolutely were. The more meaningful question is whether those moments can gradually become steady, emotionally sustainable, and consistent over time. Real intimacy is not simply reaching emotional depth for a few beautiful moments. It is having the ability to remain there together without fear repeatedly pulling one person away. Eventually, a difficult realization begins to emerge. You stop focusing only on isolated moments of closeness and begin paying attention to the overall pattern instead. Someone being able to connect deeply for a short time is not the same as being emotionally available consistently. If intimacy only appears briefly before disappearing again, what you are experiencing is not stability, it is emotional inconsistency. And sooner or later, you begin asking yourself whether occasional connection is truly enough to build something lasting. That question changes everything. You stop measuring the relationship by intense emotional highs and start asking whether the connection can remain dependable through time. Because intimacy that repeatedly disappears is not a solid foundation for the future. It becomes something you continually lose and struggle to rebuild. Healthy love should never feel like an endless process of recovering what keeps slipping away. Real love should feel steady. As you begin recognizing the repeated cycles of distance and inconsistency, another truth slowly becomes impossible to ignore. Even when someone with avoidant tendencies genuinely cares about you, there may still be a part of them that remains emotionally out of reach. You can sense it without anyone saying a word. There are moments that feel deeply authentic, yet at the same time there is still an invisible wall between the two of you. The relationship often feels almost complete, almost secure, almost fully understood, but never completely. Many people assume this uncertainty means the relationship itself is weak. Psychologically, however, it is often a form of protection. Allowing another person complete emotional access requires a level of vulnerability that goes far beyond sharing a few intimate moments. It means exposing fears, insecurities, painful memories, and hidden parts of yourself that are difficult to reveal. For someone with avoidant patterns, that kind of openness can feel genuinely unsafe. Not necessarily because they distrust you, but because vulnerability has often been connected to rejection, emotional pain, shame, overwhelm, or loss of control somewhere in their past. Instead of opening completely, they begin compartmentalizing their emotions. They reveal the parts that feel safe while keeping the deepest layers carefully protected. Much of the time this happens automatically, yet you still feel the barrier. You notice it in conversations that never quite reach full emotional depth. You notice it in the distance that remains even during affectionate moments. It is not that they are completely absent, it is that they are never fully available, and that difference matters far more than most people realize. Stay with me, because this realization changes the way you see the entire relationship. Eventually, many people begin trying to earn access to the parts that remain hidden. They believe that if they become patient enough, supportive enough, understanding enough, or loving enough, the other person will finally let them all the way in. But emotional openness cannot be created through effort alone. The other person has to willingly take part in that journey themselves. And willingness is not simply about wanting connection, it is also about having the emotional capacity to sustain it. You cannot build a deeply connected relationship with someone who is only partially emotionally available. No matter how meaningful certain moments may feel, the relationship will always be limited by the parts that remain closed off. Over time, those limitations begin changing you as well. You stop bringing up certain emotional needs because you fear creating distance. You lower your expectations to keep the peace. You become more careful with your own vulnerability. Little by little, you begin shrinking parts of yourself so the relationship feels easier to maintain. That is where the real emotional cost begins appearing. Slowly, the relationship becomes a place where complete honesty no longer feels possible for either person. The question is no longer whether they care about you. In many situations, they absolutely do. The deeper question becomes whether care without openness can truly support the kind of relationship you genuinely want. Real intimacy is never built on partial honesty or carefully managed emotional access. It grows through the willingness to be fully seen, even when that feels uncomfortable. If someone repeatedly withdraws whenever the relationship begins feeling emotionally safe, they may not simply fear losing you. They may fear what it means to fully have you. Don't miss this next part because it brings the entire pattern into focus. When you step back and look at the relationship as a whole, the pattern becomes much easier to understand. What you are often witnessing is not simply inconsistency, emotional distance, or confusing signals on their own. You are watching an internal conflict between the natural human desire for connection and the learned fear of everything that connection represents. Someone with avoidant patterns does not necessarily lack feelings. In many cases, they care deeply. They experience genuine affection. They create meaningful moments of closeness. But those experiences exist alongside another powerful system built around protection, self-reliance, and fear learned over many years. Every time intimacy begins feeling real, that protective system activates. What appears from the outside to be rejection is often an attempt to restore emotional safety from the inside. That is why the cycle repeats itself so consistently. Closeness creates emotional activation. Emotional activation awakens fear. Fear creates distance. Distance calms the nervous system. Once that sense of safety returns, connection becomes possible again. It is not a straight path toward deeper intimacy. It is a repeating loop that keeps returning to emotional distance whenever the relationship begins carrying more emotional weight than they can comfortably handle. Once you recognize that pattern, something very important changes. You realize you are not watching random behavior. You are observing a predictable emotional structure. And once a pattern becomes understandable, it loses much of its power to control your emotions. That is often where your own transformation begins. Most of the pain within these relationships does not come from distance itself. It comes from how that distance is interpreted. When you assume withdrawal means you were never loved, inconsistency means manipulation, or emotional limitations mean you are somehow not enough, you naturally enter your own cycle of emotional reactions. You chase, you overthink, you try harder, you search for answers, you work endlessly to stabilize something that was never internally stable in the first place. But when you begin viewing those behaviors through a psychological perspective, instead of taking them personally, your emotional position completely changes. You stop blaming yourself for patterns that were never created by you. You stop trying to earn consistency from someone who has not yet found consistency within themselves. You stop measuring your worth by another person's ability to remain emotionally present. Instead, you begin measuring something far more valuable. You begin measuring sustainability. Real connection is not defined by how powerful isolated emotional moments feel. It is defined by how consistently that connection continues existing without repeatedly breaking apart whenever vulnerability deepens. Genuine intimacy is not simply reaching emotional highs together. It is remaining emotionally connected through honesty, vulnerability, and stability over time. That is where one difficult truth quietly appears. Some relationships feel incredibly powerful, but cannot carry their own emotional weight over the long term. Some people are able to love deeply in certain moments but struggle to remain emotionally present consistently. Some connections feel real in short bursts yet cannot support the responsibility that lasting intimacy requires. However meaningful those moments may be, they cannot replace the steady foundation that healthy long-term relationships need.